Hello, welcome to another episode of History Hack. I'm, of course, very excited because today is World War II Day. We've got with us today Gareth Davies, who is a former soldier, battlefield guide, and a student of 20th century warfare. Hi, Gareth.
Hi, Alina.
How are you?
I'm good, because we're going to talk about tanks, Alina. And as you know, I do occasionally say that a day without a tank is a day wasted.
Do you know what? Did you not? I swear you just posted that on Twitter, like literally 5 minutes ago.
Yeah, it's a strong possibility that I did.
Tanks. Do you know what? I'm not really good with tanks. So I know a bit. I know enough. So you're going to have to teach me about this kind of stuff. Are you ready?
Yeah, no, I'm very happy to. And of course, it's probably worth saying here, although I bang on about tanks, it's not just the tanks that are important. There's some other bits that go with it. And we might bring that out as we chat about Kursk in the next 45 minutes.
Oh, yes. Yes. We've got some really interesting stuff to talk about. Okay. So how about which side, the Germans or the Soviets, which side had the best tank?
Oh, that's easy. But before anybody expects me to say a certain answer, the side that had the best tank were the Soviets. And the tank that they had, which was the best, was, of course, the Churchill tank. Because they had some British Churchill tanks. They had some Lees or Grants. I can never remember which one's which. And they also had the Valentine tank. It's probably worth just can I mention the Valentine very quickly, please?
Of course you can mention the Valentine. Go for it.
I mean, the Valentine has its fan club out there. And I'm a bit harsh on the Valentine, which is a bit unfair because the Valentine is quite interesting because it's sort of halfway house between it's a fast infantry tank. It's quite well protected, so it can sort of go toe to toe with defenders. But it's also quite fast. I mean, 15 miles an hour. These things are relative. So you could argue it's a fast infantry tank or a slightly well armored cruiser. But because it's neither one nor t'other, and it's a little small and goes out of service, it sort of gets overlooked. But people who've ever listened to me or read any of my stuff online know that I'm a massive Churchill tank fan. I predominantly do that at the expense of Sherman's because my master's thesis was basically Churchill's brilliant, Sherman's rubbish. It's a little more nuanced than that. Yeah, so the Soviets had the best tank, which was the Churchill. But I think the real answer to your question is the Soviets again. And as you said, it begins with the T-34, which is essentially using tractor technology. I know most vehicles back in the 40s used tractor technology, but it is rough and ready. But it is able to be kept going by not a peasant from the Russian steppe, because they're not all Soviet army soldiers are peasants from the Russian steppe, but it can be kept going pretty easily. It doesn't need complicated small spare parts. And that bit of the story will come out a bit later on, I think.
Okay, can I just throw a tank name in here?
Yeah.
Why didn't you not say the Tiger? Because apparently that is supposed to be one of the top-notch tanks.
See, this is where the whole, I mean, you know as well as I do, that the whole concept of a tank being one tank being better than the other is a sort of slightly trite thing to be discussing. And especially, if one goes down a top trumps route, the Tiger might well win because it's got a big gun, an 88 millimeter, whereas the T-34 has a smaller one, 76. Is it? I can never remember. The Panther is quite a good tank, but again, it's not quite as well armored as a Tiger. It doesn't have as big a gun as a Tiger. So the Tiger in top trump style is king of the pack. But it's not just about those headline numbers. It's about how you use it and how you train people to use it and how many you've got and how many spare parts you've got and how you integrate it with everything else. And so that's why I would say that the T-34 wins hands down, in my humble opinion, over a Tiger, apart from the fact that it can't destroy a Tiger head on, which some might say that's a fairly major failing on the T-34's behalf. Well, possibly, but it's not designed to destroy a Tiger on the frontal arc. It can go around the sides or around the back. So, yeah, in headline figures, Tigers are awesome. But in reality, it's nowhere near as good as that.
I'm going to make a really, really silly comment right now, and I cannot believe it has taken me this long to clock this. I've just realised the German tanks are named after animals.
Well, yes, but not all of them. So before you beat yourself up for not having realised it, most of the German tanks throughout the war, not just at Kursk, are Panzer threes and fours, Panzer fours at Kursk in 43. They don't have names, so it's only the Panzer V, which becomes the Panther, the Panzer VI, the Tiger, and then you get those funny things coming in, like the elephant. And again, we might talk about the elephant later, or the Ferdinand. And then there's a huge support gun based on a Panzer IV, the Brummbär, which again, I think is that a bear? I'm assuming it is. Maybe it's not. Maybe I've got that completely wrong. So they're not all. So I think you're being a bit harsh on yourself, Alina. They're not all named after big cats, and predominantly it's just the tiger and the panther.
Our story actually starts in Barbarossa, doesn't it?
I think it probably does. I mean, it probably starts somewhere in, I don't know. Well, I should ask you. You're Polish, so you understand the relationship between Germany and Russia, Soviet Union, both ways to the detriment of Poland, one could argue. You understand it much better than I do. And all manner of stuff happens from arguably 1940, well, before 14, all the way into to 1940. But that's not the bit I want to focus on. I think Barbarossa is the place to start. And I think it's fair to say that certainly initially, Barbarossa, what a cracking success for the Germans. How far do they advance? Well, I think I've worked out how many thousand. How far is it from Moscow to from Berlin to Moscow? Sorry,
from Berlin to Moscow. Gosh, I don't know. It's a long distance. It's a very long distance.
Yeah, absolutely. And so they I know they didn't quite get to Moscow, but the initial advances in Barbarossa in June 41 up to the 9th of July, they charged through from that line of Königsberg, Brest, and down, all the way up to, well, they're into Belarusia, they're on the they're into Ukraine. In the north, they've certainly got through Lithuania and Latvia, and they're on the door of Estonia, which they then get in the September. And so by September, where are they up to? Bryansk, Smolensk, Novgorod in the north, and almost they almost got down to Kharkov in the south, and they do take Kharkov in December. So in territorial terms, huge gains, and I think that gives the Germans a massive boost. They are able to conduct blitzkrieg, lightning war. I don't think they use the term, but these combined arms groupings, tanks, armored personnel carriers, the half-tracks, lorries, yes, a lot of horse-drawn transport as well, and the Luftwaffe helping them combine all this together for these quick and deep strikes. And I suppose Barbarossa is an example of tactical level, at the lower level, blitzkrieg being successful. At the operational level, the theatre level, it's being successful. And it's almost strategically successful, apart from the fact it doesn't take Moscow, and then it gets a bit off course later. So yeah, I think Barbarossa is the place to start, and it gave the Germans a huge amount of experience of fighting over in the Soviet Union, and it gave them an understanding of the Soviet soldier, perhaps a misunderstanding of both of those. So yes, I would absolutely start with Barbarossa.
Well, a bit like that myth where you can smell a Russian soldier from a mile away.
Yeah, I mean, well, yes. I mean, I've served with the odd Russian soldier. Actually, I've served with Ukrainian soldiers, and the Ukrainians had a much more distinctive smell of soap, coal tar soap, not of dirtiness, of cleanliness. The Russian officer I worked with, he smelt of cheap cologne, but he was very well connected, and I don't want to be rude about him because he's probably still got people out spying on me. Albert.
Sorry. Okay, so Stalingrad, Germans are now in Soviet Russia.
Let's just. I mean, I think, may I just cover Stalingrad? when do they get to Stalingrad? I can never remember. It's sort of in 42, isn't it? And they push on towards the end of 40, and Stalingrad does not work for them. And I think this is an interesting point to look at. Is perhaps, and I may be stretching an analogy here far too far, but let's look back to 1916 if we can, just briefly, to the Somme. And the German tactic there is to never give up any ground. And if they do lose any ground, they will immediately counterattack. By 1917, certainly towards the end of 1917, the Germans have changed their tactics. They are prepared to cede some ground, to then reconfigure and counterattack again. I think at Stalingrad, they make the mistake of not giving ground. And it's almost as if they've gone back to that original tactic of 1917, not their modified tactic of 1917. I mean, there are lots of other reasons why that Stalingrad fails. But just because tactics and the development of tactics fascinates me, I just thought it was worth bringing that in, if I may.
Okay. Barbarossa to Stalingrad. And then from Stalingrad, I think the logical way is Kursk, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, there's other campaigns, and they've got various names. So Stalingrad, the Soviets pushed the Germans out of it. You've got the various battles for Kharkov, and I can't remember who takes it first and who takes it second. The Germans end up taking it again in March 1943, I think it is. And so the line is moving. The northern half of the line, yeah, there were some Soviet offensives in 41, 42, which sort of took a bit up in the north on the Volga, and then Stalingrad, they take a lot of ground there, and then Kharkov is taken by the Germans. So it's by about March 1943 that the front line has stabilized and created this salient. And I, often describing Ypres as a salient, and the kids I take on tour often ask, what's a salient? Well, it's a bit of your territory that sticks out into the enemy's territory. And as a result, you're sort of surrounded on, how can you be surrounded on all three sides? You know exactly what I mean. You've got an enemy in front of you and an enemy to either side of you. And you are vulnerable if you're in a salient for a number of reasons. One, you have to be looking front, left, and right. Second, it's not a straight line from A to B. So from Oral down to Belgorod, if you drew a straight line there, the Soviets would have had a significantly shorter line, which therefore would have needed fewer troops to defend. And so in many ways, the Soviets perhaps would have liked to have had a straight line. It also is a sort of almost red rag to a bull for a force on the offensive. Seeing a salient, I think the Germans saw the opportunity, like they did at Ypres. And it's because of this salient and the opportunity to break into it from either side on the flanks and then go and create merry hell, killing Soviets. So that essentially was the aim, destruction. Gives the Germans the idea for the operation, which becomes known as Citadel.
So I'm really interested in this because I want to know more about the state of the German and Soviet army by this point, because the Germans have been fighting, the Soviets have been fighting. It's been a non-stop battle for what we're coming up to nearly two years now at this point, aren't we?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's stuff going on in North Africa, obviously, but that is not the main fight. At this stage, it's predominantly going on in the east. Yes, okay, North Africa. The Germans do win at Kasserine originally, but by April, by February, I think it is, they win at Mareth in Tunisia, and by April, the campaign in North Africa is in its final flushes. And so there's not much going on down there. There's nothing happening in Italy yet, but we'll come to that in a minute. So the main activity is in the east, and so therefore the Germans are drawing, and the Soviets, their experience from the east into their future plans. And I think that's where the Germans get it wrong and the Soviets get it right. You've got an element of Western arrogance coming in on the German side. Now, the British are pretty good at this. We did it at Gallipoli. We did it in the First World War. We did it in Palestine in the First World War, fighting against Johnny Turk. We thought it would be easy to defeat the peasant armies of the Ottomans then. And I think even though they had suffered at the end around Moscow and at Stalingrad, the Germans still felt that they were better than the Soviets. The soldiers were better and brighter. Their kit was better. Well, and in certain ways, I think that's true, Alina. But the Tiger tank is a more sophisticated tank than a T-34, as is the Panther. But sophisticated doesn't always mean better, because you can repair a T-34, less sophisticated tank, more easily using a hammer and whatever a blacksmith has available. I'm stretching it slightly, more easily than you can highly specialized spare parts needed for a Tiger or a Panther. So there was this view, I think, by the Germans that the Soviets were easier to beat than perhaps they were. I think the Germans also had an over-extended view of the Luftwaffe's ability. But again, this is based on a certain amount of experience, a certain amount of knowledge here. They have had some successes, and there are elements of truth involved. I think the Soviets, they've thought about it. They know what they're up against. And they've, in the past, in their offensives, got it wrong, the Soviets, in terms of estimating what the German defenses were, or the German opposition was for the offensive. Heading into the summer of 43, the Soviets have got a much better idea of what they are facing the other side of the line, both in the Kursk salient and to the north, because the Soviets are planning an attack of their own. Because there's actually another salient further north, which the Germans own. And so that is the state of play, I think is the best way of putting it. Germans, lots of experience, some good kit, decent amount of people-ish, but a level of confidence and planning challenges because of the way in which the Nazi regime is set up. Soviets, significantly more people, lots and lots of people who may not be high quality, but excuse the old trite saying, but quantity has a quality all of its own. The Soviets also have their slightly convoluted planning system, because whether you're a Nazi dictatorship or a communist dictatorship, you seem to have levels of control that don't allow too much free thinking. But the Soviets have got it right, I would say, coming up to Citadel and Kursk.
I mean, I can see the arrogance from the German army. I can totally understand that. The confidence of what they did in the invasion of Poland, the confidence when they invaded Soviet Russia. It's completely and utterly understandable.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of other things that play in. I mean, what were the Germans trying to achieve? Let's just sort that. First of all, they, as I said and hinted at, they wanted to kill soldiers and tanks in the Kursk salient, and this was designed to prevent the Soviets going on the offensive. They'd never be able to completely annihilate the Soviets on a numbers, one-for-one basis, I don't think, because the Soviets had many more men to call on. They also wanted a whole load of prisoners of war, because they needed labor in Germany. And so let's take some Soviets and some Russians, bung them back in Germany as slave labor. That releases Germans to go be soldiers. And as I said, they want to sort of shorten their line as well, so they have fewer people and regain the initiative. I think the Soviets have a number of things playing to their advantage, which the Germans don't have. They have, I think they're pretty certain that national survival isn't at stake anymore. I think after the failure of Barbarossa and then the failure of Stalingrad, I think the Soviets are fairly confident, and rightly so, that the Soviet state is going to continue pretty much as it was. Well, as we know, the answer is it actually expands after the war. So they have a confidence that comes from that, and I think it's a fair confidence. They also know what the Germans are planning to do, because it's so obvious. You don't want assailants there. Of course, the Germans are going to attack it, but they also have a decent amount of intelligence. The Soviets, they've got lots of people and equipment, and yes, the Allies are winning in North Africa. So they've got a plan, a counter plan, although it's their own plan, to first resist any German attack, which they know is going to happen, and then go on the offensive. So, both sides' plans make some sense. The German plan isn't daft. It's understandable. But the more and more you look at exactly the Soviet defences in detail, the more you realise that this is a tough nut to crack, if you pardon the trite expression.
Air power. I think I want to know a little bit more about this, because we all know that Luftwaffe is very, very well organised. Nobody can doubt that. But do they end up joining the fight?
Yeah, they do. It's interesting. I think the Germans they don't have air superiority across the front. But what they are able to do in a way that perhaps hasn't been done before is they're able to, has been done before, they're able to concentrate their air power. And so the fact that they're lacking it initially isn't so much of a problem for them. They can move it around. I think the one area where the German Western arrogance, I called it earlier, is fair, is their view of the Luftwaffe, of the Soviet Air Force. The Soviet Air Force is not in a good state. Their equipment arguably isn't as good, and in numbers terms, it doesn't quite work out in their favour. So I think that's the one area where the Germans are at an advantage. Can we press pause there? Because I've just got to find one note I wrote, Lena, and I can't find it.
So Alex will edit. I've just pressed the record button. So the question was, does the Luftwaffe join in the fight?
Yeah. In fact, the air forces on both sides join the fight. And I suppose on paper, the Germans are right in their assessment of the Soviet Air Force, that the Germans can do a bit better. But in the end, I think we end up with two air forces fighting almost on an equal basis. The Soviets gain the initiative from the air right from the start, and they begin with an attack from the air against German air installations. But it doesn't actually achieve anywhere near as much as they'd intended, partly because they don't get to the right places, and in fact, it takes planes away from doing other tasks, so perhaps hinders them a little bit. And the retaliation by the Germans also has a significant impact on the Soviet Air Force. And so for the rest of the day, in the first day of the battle, the Air Force, the Luftwaffe, have the upper hand. And what are the Luftwaffe doing? Well, they're providing air superiority, i.e. shooting down Soviet fighters. They're trying to keep any reinforcements, Soviet reinforcements, away from the battlefield. And theoretically, their third role is to provide that close air support. But they do quite a bit of that. Stukas are involved, and they've developed a system where they use guns mounted on some of their aircraft as tank busters. And the Germans have developed this over a bit of time, and it works quite well. But in the end, I think the air battle is on an equal footing, but the Soviets have to fly almost twice as many sorties as the Germans to achieve parity, if not a slight dominance, by the Soviets. That's my limit of the air. Sorry.
You prefer being on the ground rather than up in the air?
Well, yeah, and that's I will admit fully to everybody listening in that air forces in general across an air support to the ground battle, whilst absolutely vital and really useful, it's not an area of my expertise.
There we go, ladies and gentlemen. Right, so obviously the fighting starts somewhere. Where does it start?
Yeah, well, there are two prongs to the attack, and I think it's just can I talk first about the Soviet defences because
Of course.
this is massive. This is First World War style. This is trenches and trenches and defences. So the Soviets have dug miles and miles and miles and miles and miles of trenches, tank ditches, and they've laid mines like they're going out of fashion. I think we've got something like 1,000 anti-tank and 1,500 anti-personnel mines per kilometre of the front. Now, somebody clever can probably add that up. I mean, the front is what, 1, 2, 3, 400 kilometres. So that's several million mines are laid. And the Soviets have got what I would call a very similar layout to the First World War, to the German system. Each line of trenches has several layers to it, and there are several lines of trenches: the front line, the second line, the third line, etc. I've read somewhere that each Soviet soldier dug 5 meters of trench a night. Again, I haven't done the maths on that, but it certainly makes some sense. So you've got the most amazing defensive system, all of those obstacles designed to stop or slow down the German Panzer and Panzergrenadier and infantry divisions. And as they slow down or get stuck on those obstacles, the Soviets have got, using their own tanks, using anti-tank guns, using artillery, and using their own air force, will come and attack the Germans. So this is a tough nut to crack. I'm sorry, that's a really trite statement, but cliche. It really is. And there's sort of two approaches are taken. You've got Manstein in the south and Kluger in the centre, the sort of the army group commanders, and Manstein, who's got essentially a panzer army, panzer army and an infantry army under command, has quite a bold plan, and it's very much tanks lead and infantry in support of them. In the north, you've got Model, and Model is a much more cautious, that's a bit unfair. It's a more cautious approach. It's more of an infantry-led attack, and neither is right nor wrong, but it is interesting that you have this difference of approach. So what happens? Well, Model starts at about 5:30 in the morning with his attack, and he puts his engineers, pioneers, in to clear the minefield. They've also got these tiny little remote-controlled mine destruction tanks. They're called Goliaths, and they don't work brilliantly well, but they're what, 4 foot long, 1.5 meters maybe long, 0.5 meter wide, 0.75 meter wide, full of explosives, and they go off into an enemy minefield and are exploded, which sets off the mines.
They're horrible, horrible things.
Yeah, thankfully they don't work well. Thankfully for the Soviets, they don't work that well then. And it's interesting, there's lots of chatter nowadays about unmanned ground vehicles being the future of warfare. Well, they were tried in 1943, so there's nothing new under the sun, really. And so once we've got those through, this is the north, this is the slightly cautious attack. Some assault troops, mainly dismounted infantry, go in under the cover of artillery, naval Werfers, the multi-barrel rocket launcher things, and assault guns. But they don't get very far in their eastern attack. In the centre of the north, it's a bit more mixed in terms of infantry and armour. And actually, within a shortish period of time, one of the divisions has got about 5 kilometres into the Soviet defences, which is pretty significant in many ways. But it's just one division out of many who are involved. In the south, different attitude. It's the tanks that are in the lead. And that includes a couple of battalions of Panthers, which haven't been in action before. They haven't really conducted any training en masse. They've trained as individual crews. And the Panthers have a pretty poor start. I think some 20 of them don't even get to the start line. So I'm trying to think how many Panthers. There's 200 Panthers, I think, in the south. So 10% fail to get to the start line because of breakdowns. And those that do get there suffer, half of them manage to sort of suffer mechanical breakdowns. So by the end of the 5th of July, 43, over 100 of those Panthers, half of them, this new weapon, and this is its first outing in battle, over half were out of action, although some of it was only minor damage that in theory, if the spare parts had been available, they could have been repaired and put back into battle pretty quickly. But the spare parts weren't available. This is the problem with the Panther, and to some extent the Tiger suffers as well. It's highly complex, which means mending it, once it's a bit bent, needs specialist training, equipment, and parts. You can't just get your welding kit out and your hammer and batter it into back into place. So mixed experiences on that opening day on the 5th. And gosh, what have we got? I'm just thinking about sort of casualties. About 13,000 casualties. That's not dead. About 13,000 casualties, of which 2,500 Germans killed on that opening day. I mentioned quite a lot of tanks, Panthers out of action. In the north, Model has lost something like 18 of his Tigers as well. So it's not a great start.
Not going too well, is it?
No, but then again, arguably, I said these Soviet defences are strong, long, and deep. So how else do you overcome it? You sort of have to keep bashing your way through, and they're trying to find a way in so that once they have got through, they can exploit it. But that's the challenge they're having, and that goes on the next day. There's a bit of a breakthrough in the south. Hoth, the army commander, I can never remember the level, so he's an army commander. He tries to expand his breakthrough and push on to the second line. And actually, by the end of the second day, on the 6th, the second SS Panzer Corps has probably advanced about 25 kilometres. The problem is, I keep making analogies to the Somme. This is a bit like the 36th Division on the 1st of July 16 on the Somme. On that day on the Somme, the 36 did really quite well. But the people either side of them didn't do so well, so they were exposed and therefore had to withdraw. Second SS Panzer, I don't think they withdraw, but again, there isn't the success on the flanks, so they are vulnerable. And so, and they do get counterattacked. Well, in fact, the whole of the German force, both north and south, gets counterattack, and the army group central, what's his name, Rokossovsky. I don't know if you heard of Rokossovsky. He gets imprisoned before the war. He loses a few teeth and a few fingernails in prison, but he's rehabilitated and ends up as an army commander. And he is able to counterattack and stop some of that advance to the north. And it sort of goes on. I mean, I'm massively oversimplifying, but it sort of goes on like that for the next few days. This doesn't mean that the Germans aren't having success. They are having some success. They are wearing down the Soviets. I think I think it's the 8th of July. The Luftwaffe attack with their it's a Hensch, I can never remember the number, with the 30mm cannons, and they managed to destroy some 80 tanks from Second Guards Tank Corps, destroyed in the south. And so there is attrition happening. The Germans are having success, but I think the point is that the Soviets have got more people to throw into the battle, and so it's small advances each way. And having mentioned those figures, Alina, I wonder, is it worth just having a quick diversion into talking about the facts and figures in terms of casualties, if we may?
Yes, of course, go for it. I mean, I'm assuming there were quite large casualties.
There were, but I just want to talk about the sort of validity of some figures or not. And if you were to ask me, how many tanks were involved and how many casualties there were there and so on. I think the simple answer is I don't know, because it all depends on whose book you read. And Kursk, I mean, this is why Kursk is quite interesting. We've all heard about Kursk, and it's the biggest tank battle of the Second World War. Well, was it? Might that actually just mean...
Was it?
Pardon?
Was it?
Well, was it? Was it? Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't think it necessarily was, but it all depends on how you measure it. Because Kursk is this larger battle. The pincer movement into the salient, but there's this famous tank battle at Prokhorovka, which we'll come on to in a minute, that is often talked about. And you read after the war, well, basically getting hold of an archive was pretty challenging. You had, two sets of archives. The German archives, which were hard to get into, and the Soviet archives, which were almost impossible to get into. And post-war Germany, there was this, well, there wasn't much, they'd lost. And so, Hitler was dead, and so you could blame everything on Hitler. And perhaps some of the stories were overblown in both directions. For the same reasons, the Soviets definitely overplay their successes, and in terms of the numbers destroyed. And so, how many tanks are in action? Well, if you look at some of the figures, you end up with more tanks in action than that formation had available to it, because it includes all the reinforcements. So that becomes difficult to count. The other thing is, what do we compare? If we compare purely geographically, it sort of cuts one of the sides. So let's take, if we were to take the 9th, 2nd, 4th, and Group Kempf armies of the Germans and count them up, they're not coming up against a Soviet formations that subdivide in exactly the same way. So to work out how many tanks from, say, for example, the Bryansk front were involved and weren't involved is beyond my capability. Now, a number of historians more recently have come up with that. I mean, Glantz and House are perhaps the two who've come quite close. And the British are starting to get it. Some British, Ben Wheatley, for example, have done some really detailed number crunching on Prokhorovka. But the simple answer is I don't know, but I'll come up with some figures at the end. So that was a little diversion. Where did we got to? I can't remember. Oh, we got into sort of third or fourth day, hadn't we?
Yeah, because the Soviets at some point counterattack, don't they?
Yeah, well, there are counterattacks going on at all levels quite a lot of the time. I think the thing the first thing is that 8th, 9th, the Germans are making progress. Having mentioned that the air attacks on the 9th in the south, 2nd SS Panzer Corps pushes on to the river, the Psel River, which is just west of Prokhorovka. And arguably, it's making progress. These are not huge distances, but when you consider what they're up against, it's the 40 Ks in. And then what happens? The Allies invade Sicily, which causes a problem back in Berlin, because they kind of knew it was coming, and they know that Sicily will lead to an invasion of Italy, and so on. But there's now two fronts again, where the Germans have to make a decision. Which of their fronts are they going to go and reinforce? And that causes a pause. And the pause is predominantly in the north, but in the south, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps keeps going and pushes on towards Prokhorovka. And Manstein in the south, who owns Hoth, wants to keep going, whereas in the north, things have settled down, and that pushes us on to Prokhorovka, which in some people's minds is the totemic tank battle of the Second World War, which is often referred to as the Battle of Kursk, where the Soviets destroyed German armour in their thousands, or not.
Did they?
No.
Okay.
No, they didn't. Prokhorovka, I don't know. Had you heard of Prokhorovka before as a separate part of Kursk?
Never.
Okay, I mean that in itself isn't a bad thing. Prokhorovka is, I can't remember, is it the 13th, 14th? I should know that off the top of my head, really, shouldn't I? It has achieved in certain areas mythical status, and some people say that this was the biggest tank battle. It's defined. Who is it? I think a single titanic struggle. No, it's not. It's a series of confusing to me, the historian, looking at it, and I think confused to those fighting it, series of sort of meeting engagements, because a lot of the time both armies, both sides are on the move, and they're literally bumping into each other. There's some hasty attacks that go on, some counterattacks, and it's not coordinated in a way that the initial large-scale attacks of Kursk, the invasion, was coordinated. So you get these small actions, and the famous tank battle of Prokhorovka is supposed to have, the 12th of July, did I say 13th? I do apologize. It's supposed to have destroyed, let's say, hundreds of German tanks. Well, I can't with any certainty, and I apologize to Ben Wheatley for saying this, say whether he is right or not. But on one side, you have this legend, Soviets destroyed hundreds of German tanks. Then Ben Wheatley is saying that actually only 5 German tanks were destroyed, or something like that. Well, the reality is somewhere in the middle, but it's in the lower numbers in the middle. And there are books published, and I've read them, that the Germans lost hundreds. And so, well, I tell you, did he lose hundreds? And the Guards tank army of the Soviets, they lost nearly 200. So I don't know. I don't know exactly in that battle, but overall, I can make a stab at it. Overall, for Kursk, Germans lost 300, 400, 500 tanks and armored vehicles.
That's
whereas
a lot.
it is a lot, but they're starting big. And the Soviets, what do they lose? Well, 2, 3, maybe 4 times as many. And that's a heck of a lot. So it's difficult to say, but it also doesn't necessarily mean anything. Again, we're back to that top trumps we talked about earlier, Alina, with looking at the tanks. On the top trump basis, Tiger probably the best. And so if you look at Germans lost significantly fewer tanks than the Soviets, well, it must have been a German victory. Well, no, because Germans have reduced their combat effectiveness significantly. Some 30 divisions are now really, out of about 70, so just under half, are combat ineffective. The Soviets lost significantly more, but they've still got even more people to throw into the battle. And so it's one of those battles where it's a bit like Jutland. I keep going back to the First World War. That's probably because my roots in military history are in the First World War. I compare it to Jutland. At Jutland, the Germans suffered fewer casualties and ships destroyed than the British. Yet the German Navy was essentially beaten at Jutland. I would argue that the significant similarities, the German losses were much lower than the Soviet losses at Kursk. But I don't think the Germans won in any way, shape, or form. The Soviets didn't necessarily win, but it's a turning point. And from then on, whilst successes are localized, I mean, localized covers quite a large area, it's all downhill for the Germans, I would say.
Does not sound good at all. This is pretty much the downfall, isn't it?
Well, I think so. I mean, again, it is. I mean, the Germans. Sorry, you asked about the Soviet counterattack. The Soviets had planned this large counterattack to the north of the Kursk salient, and that is, into from their own salient, and that takes place. And so Kutuzov. Yeah, Kutuzov. I can't believe it's really called that. I've only just realised that, Alina. It's Kutuzov, but I suppose it could be cut us off. I shouldn't joke about the names of offensives, and that starts on the 12th of July. So whilst this mythical Battle of Prokhorovka is going on, the Soviet counteroffensive in the north starts, and so yes, the combination of all of that is the start of the end. I think it's fair to say, and then from December 43 onwards, the Soviets are on the offensive, and by December, they've crossed the Dnieper in the south, and whilst they've still got a way to go in sort of Belarus, they're not into Minsk. That takes some time. They've gained quite a lot of ground, and so yeah, it is a start point, I think, of the turnaround.
So, what do you think that the two sides learnt from this?
Yeah, I suppose the Germans learnt that they probably weren't going to win. I think they learnt, although they already knew, that their decision-making process of the German High Command was stifled from the top, and whilst they had some sound minds and the likes of Guderian and others come in there, they were interfered with too much, and I think they learnt that. And I think they learnt the hard way that perhaps blitzkrieg, certainly as a sort of strategic act, was not working for them anymore. That doesn't mean it wasn't able to work in the future. What did the Soviets learn? Well, they learned that their combined arms techniques that they perhaps used first at Kursk, something that the Germans had used all the way back in 1940, when they invaded the Low Countries in northern France, and what the Brits were still trying to learn and didn't quite get right in 44. We're getting right better in 45. The Soviets were learning that, and they applied it. They hadn't refined it as a result of Kursk, but they worked out the best way to do it, to bring the infantry together with infantry support tanks and self-propelled guns and so on, and then when you've got a hole through, to exploit through with faster moving armor. And so I think the Soviets come away, certainly a few months after, certainly going into 44, having learnt some significant lessons from the Germans and from themselves that I think any modern army would understand as being valid today about combined arms warfare.
Gareth, thank you so much for joining us today. That was absolutely fantastic.
My pleasure. Well, thank you for inviting me, Alina.
I love it. I think we need to get you back to come and talk about your favourite tank.
Oh, okay. I'd be very happy to do that.
I'll make sure we put that into the diary.
Tune in tomorrow, because we will be joined by Manuela del Borgo. This is brilliant. She came to talk to us all about Thucydides, and it was absolutely fascinating. It's a really good talk, so don't miss out on that one. Don't forget that we do exist on Patreon as History Hack, and on Patreon as well, which is Podbean's own version. Alina and I have had massive fun doing this in 2020, but life's going to change quite a lot next year, and we're going to actually have to go and earn a living, etc. If we want to keep up the regularity that we've been bringing you, and the kind of guests that we've been bringing you, and the workload, then we will need your help. So if you join us on either of those platforms, Marcus is currently working on some benefits for you, so there's going to be incentives for joining on either of those platforms. We're revamping ourselves on both of them, so don't forget to go in. You can do as little as $1 a month, and it all goes towards keeping up History Hack as regular as we've been able to bring it to you this year. We are now on YouTube. We are posting all of our new episodes on there, and we have our own channel, and we are gradually posting all of the back episodes, because we have been made aware of the fact that you can only find the last 100 on some platforms. So you can go and listen to your heart's content and laugh at the cartoons and have a great time. So do go over there and subscribe.